companies will only ever pay you enough to keep you from leaving. I mean, just look at how promotions work at tech companies, for example. Like, you're basically expected to be doing the job at the next level before you get promoted. There is a lot of quote unquote alpha in the market because a lot of smart and really conscientious people are just too afraid to take the risk. So today I want to talk about a very fascinating topic that I read about recently, and it's the idea of liquid versus illiquid careers. Now, I first read about this through an article written by a guy named Vaishnav Sunil on Substack, and I'll link his article in the description below. But essentially, he breaks down this concept of liquidity in people's careers. Now, often when we hear the word liquidity, we think about financial markets. And so if you think about the stock market, for example, a liquid asset or a liquid security is essentially something that can be traded frequently and where the market value of that security or that stock is very easily determined. And so public markets are a great example of this. If I go on Robinhood, for example, I know exactly what the stock of any publicly traded company is at any given moment in time. But if we look at a different kind of asset class, like private equity, for example, it's very difficult to know at any specific point in time what the true value of a private equity firm's portfolio is because it's a very illiquid asset. And so you can't just immediately sell it and find a buyer. And so if we think about career liquidity in the context of like career paths and jobs, what you'll realize is there's also a really, really fascinating spectrum as well. And so I'm going to read a little bit from this article, but he writes that, just like in financial markets, some human capital is easier to price and trade than others. And this isn't about the absolute value of your skills and experience, but how easily the market can actually assess and exchange your skills or experience. And so let me give a specific example here. Consider Jim, with 4 years of experience as a management consultant at McKinsey. Now, in the job market, potential employers have a good idea of what they're buying. Someone smart and conscientious enough to be hired by McKinsey, meets a reasonably high bar in commercial acumen and communication skills, and is polished enough to have managed clients and moved one step higher on the well-defined McKinsey ladder. Now, Jim's skills are highly legible to every potential employer. They can estimate his salary within narrow confidence intervals, given that McKinsey's pay structure is essentially public information. And if Jim ever did decide to switch jobs or move countries, all else equal, he can be relatively confident about his chances of landing a job that pays him his quote-unquote market value. And so just like stocks in the stock market, if you work a very liquid career path, if you have spent your entire career in a very liquid career, in a career where it's very clear how much people at different levels get paid and what the true value of your skills and experience are, then you're not going to have a hard time at all when it comes to finding new jobs or for other employers to price you properly. Now, on the flip side, if we look at someone else who, say, graduated from school, maybe spent like a year traveling and then joined a nonprofit for a couple months and then did a bunch of random side projects and finally has joined a AI startup, when you are a potential employer, it is much harder to value this person's skills because you don't really have that many comps or comparables. You don't have examples of many, many other people exactly like him or her and how much you can pay them or how much you should pay them, for example. And it's very unclear to you as well whether or not this person is actually going to be someone that can be value additive to your organization. Like, sure, this guy could be, or this girl could be an absolute rock star in your company, but at the same time, they could also be someone that's like a net negative and you're going to regret hiring 6 months later. And so from the employer's perspective, and employers are often very, very risk averse, it makes a lot more sense to hire someone with a very legible career path where you know for a fact that, oh, like this person has this set of skills and I know exactly what I'm sort of getting. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to every rule, but this is a big reason why, for example, people say that you should work in investment banking or consulting for the exit options or so that you're setting yourself up for success. You're setting your career up for success. Now, what does that even mean? Well, it's not just like the money and the skills, but it's also the career capital and the visibility to your future employers that, hey, I am this person and I have this level of skills. Like I was smart enough to be hired into software engineering, or I was, hardworking enough to get into investment banking, or, maybe I just had like a lot of connections, but still I was able to get in, and therefore you can value my skills and my experience at this amount. Now, obviously, there are downsides to following a very strict liquid career path, including the fact that, just strictly financially speaking, you're never going to earn as much as a McKinsey consultant as you would if you were a successful AI startup founder who ended up selling his company to Google. There's just no comparison there. On the other hand, proponents of liquid career paths would say the following, which is that in addition to the obviously financial compensation and the stable paycheck that you get from a very liquid career path, there's also this element of psychological comfort and optionality. Now, psychological comfort is this idea that, you have a lot of certainty over what your future will look like. Because if you, say, work in consulting, you know that every couple of years you're either going to get promoted or kicked out. And if you can get promoted, then you're going to get paid a certain amount. And if you get promoted again, you'll get paid a certain amount. And then eventually, if you make it a partner, you'll be able to make a certain amount. It's very, very clear to the people who are very junior. Like when I was a junior consultant at BCG, it was very, very, very apparent to me what I needed to do in order to eventually make it to partner. Like, definitely not easy by any means, but very, very clear what one needs to do in order to progress. And also very, very clear to other employers what the value of your skills is, because it's basically public information, how much a BCG partner makes or how much a BCG associate or consultant makes. And so there's pros and cons to that. But for a lot of people, the psychological comfort of knowing, if I just stick around and do a good job for the next 5-10 years, like I know I can get to this point, that is very, very powerful and is in and of itself a form of value as well. And if you compare that to, say, someone who's a startup founder, I have a few friends who are startup founders, and let me tell you, one of the biggest, most difficult aspects of founding a company is the uncertainty and just not knowing if even a year from now you're still going to have a job. And yes, the potential upside reward is potentially much higher, but at the same time, you have to be able to stomach that uncertainty, and you have to need that risk tolerance to be able to do this kind of a thing. And as for the optionality piece, which is the other benefit you get from liquid career paths, is the fact that, again, it's very easy for you to switch companies or even switch industries or go to a different country. Employers will have very good data or better data on how much they should value your skills and your experiences versus if you did a very non-traditional career path and then tried to move to a company in a completely different country, then it would be quite difficult for them to actually price you at your market value. And so then he also talks about a bunch of different factors that basically drive liquidity in someone's career path. And I'll just rattle out a few here. One of them being industry growth and activity. For example, skills that can be deployed in high growth industries or sectors with high levels of activity tend to be more liquid because of the increased trading volume of human capital. And also skill specificity. For example, if you have very specific skills that are very clear and well-defined, for example, an example here they give is being like a carpenter. It's very well-defined and easily understood, whereas if you work a job where it's a little bit more unclear what your actual role was, then it can be much more difficult for your next employer to pinpoint the value of your skills. Also testability. For example, if you're a lawyer or you're a doctor who had to pass the board exams, it's just very, very clear, okay, this person passed this test, so therefore the value of their skills and experience is at least this much, right? And then also things like institutional brand. For example, if you worked at a prestigious company like Goldman Sachs, for example, sure, probably not everyone who worked at Goldman Sachs was a very good employee, but it certainly is a pretty helpful heuristic when you're a company that's hiring a candidate and all else being equal, there's one guy that has Goldman Sachs on his resume and then one guy that has not Goldman Sachs on his resume. Employers are really, really risk averse. So they're going to use institutional brand as another heuristic for saying, okay, this person must have a reasonable level of intelligence and conscientiousness and communication skills and professionalism because they passed and jumped through all the hoops in order to get to Goldman Sachs. So if they reach the Goldman Sachs standard, then there's a good chance that they'll also meet ours. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, wow, well, you're talking about how these liquid career paths are so great. Like, it almost sounds like you think it's better than going down an illiquid career path. And I would caveat that by saying, even though you do get a lot of this psychological comfort and certainty from liquid career paths, they're also often much more competitive as a result. Because if you think about like the recruiting process at a top consulting firm, for example, it's very, very, very structured. It's very standardized. Every year they do the same thing. They go to the same schools. They recruit the same profile of students. They conduct the interviews the same way. They use the same types of cases. They ask the same kinds of behavioral questions. It is very, very clear to applicants what they need to do in order to get that job. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's very clear what they need to do. Versus if you're trying to do something that nobody has done before, like you're trying to start a company that, I don't know, sends people to Mars, right? Like that's something no one's done before. Then that is going to be a lot more difficult. By virtue of that, less people are going to try to go down that path. And so there's an argument to be had that there is a lot of quote unquote alpha in the market because a lot of smart and really conscientious people are just too afraid to take the risk and to go down the uncertain route or the path that is not well trodden. And like, I'm not saying that it's a bad thing by any means to go down the traditional path. Like, look at me. I've basically stuck to like lower risk career options my entire career so far. And I do value the certainty and the psychological comfort, as I mentioned, of having a regular corporate job. But there is something to be said. If you have the risk tolerance and the desire and the ambition and the idea of something that you really want to pursue, like, don't be turned off by the fact that nobody's done it before, because that could actually be a good thing and it could work in your favor. And so that kind of leads me to thinking about like the reasons that someone would want to pursue an illiquid career path. And there are a few outlined in this article that are pretty helpful, a few that I want to talk about as well. And the first one being this idea of whether or not you have a really clear vision for what you want to do. Now, if you are someone who has a super clear idea from day one, like this is what I want to do, then I 100% think that it is worth it for you to go down the illiquid career path. As long as you stick to it and you don't quit, like there's a high chance that you'll actually succeed. Versus, I think a lot of people that don't really have a clear vision, this is where they find a lot more value, and this is why you do see a lot of really smart people from Ivy League universities going into careers like investment banking or consulting or tech, is because they simply don't have a very clear vision on what they want to do, and they want the time to build the skills and to explore a little bit more before they do find that one thing that they want to stick to. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that there's a lot of value in understanding and working in an institutional environment and really like seeing how things are done. Second, which I kind of touched on already, is whether or not you have a high appetite or a risk tolerance, and if you can stomach the uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen. I think this might be one of the most important things, actually, because if you can't take the uncertainty of knowing what's going to happen a year from now, then you certainly shouldn't try to force yourself into an illiquid career path just because you think there will be a higher potential financial reward or something. And then finally, I think the last piece is whether or not you believe that your intrinsic value is higher than what the market can price you at. So a good example of this is managing directors or partners at like top global investment banks that end up leaving to start their own firm. So a great example is Ken Moelis, the founder of Moelis & Company, which is an elite boutique investment bank. For those of you who don't know, before he started Moelis & Company, was actually a rainmaker at the global investment bank UBS, which is a bulge bracket Swiss investment bank. And he was making lots of money. Like, he was a rainmaker, but he eventually left and started his own company. Now, if you think about like why on earth would someone with everything going for him leave and do something so risky like start his own firm, which could have failed? And a lot of people told him that, hey, dude, like you might want to rethink your decision to leave. And I believe the reason that he still went on and did that was because he believed that his intrinsic value was higher than what they could price him at. Because let's be honest, guys, companies will only ever pay you enough to keep you from leaving. And that amount is different from what you are truly worth. In a lot of cases, if you've built up a lot of skills and really valuable ones, then by working at a company, you're just not ever going to get paid the amount that your skills are truly worth. I mean, just look at how promotions work at tech companies, for example. Like, you're basically expected to be doing the job at the next level before you get promoted, which means that for a time before you get promoted, the value of your skills is actually worth more than what they're paying you. Does that make sense? Let me know if I'm just completely going off the rails here, but that's just kind of how I think about it. And so to tie this all up, I think this concept of liquid and illiquid careers is a really interesting one. And as you all think about your career moves and your next steps and how you want to chart the next course of your career decisions, just keep this in mind, because sometimes it does make sense to pursue a liquid career path, and other times it makes sense to maybe do something that is a little bit less illiquid because you are ready or you have conviction that the value of your skill set is more than the market is able to price you at. But anyways, that's all I got for you, and I hope you found it interesting. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.